It came like thunder in the stillness of night. A dream so vivid, it shook the most powerful man on earth. 7 fat cows, then 7 thin ones devouring them. A nightmare that whispered of death, of hunger, and of judgment. You're watching Midnight Psalms, where the silence of night meets the voice of heaven. Here we dive deep into divine dreams, ancient truths, and the mysterious ways God speaks in the dark. The palace was silent, cloaked in darkness, with only the soft flicker of torches dancing on golden walls as Pharaoh tossed in restless sleep. Though his body lay still, his spirit had entered a realm no guards could protect, a space where power held no sway and pride was stripped away, the realm of divine warning. In this midnight hour, Egypt's ruler found himself standing at the edge of the Nile, surrounded by still waters that hid the secrets of eternity. From the shadows emerged 7 cows, sleek and healthy, feeding peacefully among the reeds, their presence almost calming, almost deceptive like the calm before a storm. But suddenly the dream shifted, as though the very atmosphere had soured. 7 more cows appeared, this time thin, gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their bodies like walking famine, dragging bones across the mud as they moved. Then, in a grotesque moment Pharaoh could not unsee, these thin cows devoured the fat ones, not in rage or hunger but with cold inevitability, and though they had consumed plenty they remained thin, empty, insatiable, a horror with no satisfaction. The king awoke breathless, heart pounding like the chariots of war, the vision seared into his mind with a terror no sword could dispel. But as he tried to shake it off, sleep dragged him back into the grip of another vision, one no less disturbing. This time he stood among grain fields swaying in the warm Egyptian sun, golden heads full and plentiful, a symbol of wealth, stability and divine favor. Again 7 stalks appeared, lush and heavy with promise, but like a cruel echo 7 more emerged, scorched by the east wind, thin and dying, their tips blackened like ash. Then in the same twisted logic of the first dream, the withered stalks swallowed the healthy ones, erasing abundance with absence. When Pharaoh awoke again he could not breathe, for he knew this was no ordinary dream and no ordinary fear. The gods of Egypt were silent, and in that silence, a voice beyond their temples had spoken. None of his magicians could interpret the dream, and none of his wise men dared fabricate meaning. Their silence only amplified the weight in Pharaoh's chest, a dread that ruled over him more than his own crown. For a man who commanded armies and nations, the inability to understand his own dream was a torment he could not endure. But then from the corner of the palace, a voice rose, hesitant, respectful, almost guilty. It was the chief cupbearer, who remembered a Hebrew slave he had forgotten for years, a young man with a gift no chains could bind. There is a man, he said, in the dungeon who interprets dreams, and he speaks not from magic but from God. And so Joseph was summoned, washed, and brought before the most powerful man in the world, a man reduced to trembling by the shadows of sleep. Joseph stood before Pharaoh not as a beggar nor as a prisoner, but as a vessel, calm, clear-eyed, and confident in something far greater than himself. I cannot interpret it, he said with humility, but God can. And in that single sentence, the court leaned in, the air shifted, and something holy entered the room. Joseph listened carefully as Pharaoh recounted the dreams, then without pause or fear, he spoke the truth like a blade cutting through confusion. The dreams are one and the same. And God is warning you. Then he revealed the meaning with bold clarity. 7 years of abundance were coming to Egypt, years of overflowing granaries and bursting barns. But they would be followed by 7 years of famine so severe, the memory of plenty would vanish as if it never existed. This was not a suggestion, not a theory, it was a divine revelation delivered through a foreigner standing in chains. Joseph's courage was not just in speaking truth to power, but in offering a solution no one else could see. Let Pharaoh appoint a wise man, he said, and store 1/5 of the harvest during the 7 good years. Prepare for what is coming, because when the famine arrives, it will devour everything unprepared. The boldness of this Hebrew man stirred something in Pharaoh, something no priest or prince had touched, a sense that this was not politics or luck, but purpose. And in that moment, Pharaoh did the unthinkable. He appointed Joseph second in command over all of Egypt, placing a slave above nobles and naming him steward of survival. It was more than promotion. It was a sign that when God sends a warning, he also sends a way. The dream had not come to Joseph but to Pharaoh, and yet the meaning was entrusted to a man who had suffered in silence, betrayed by brothers, forgotten by friends, yet faithful in every shadow. Joseph had endured his own famine of love, justice, and freedom, and now, through him, a nation would be saved. This is how God works in the night. He warns through dreams, speaks through silence, and lifts the humble to places of power for purposes far beyond their own comfort. Joseph's rise was not about revenge or reward, It was about responsibility, about standing in the gap between disaster and deliverance. Pharaoh's nightmare had become a message and Joseph had become the messenger. The years passed exactly as Joseph had foretold, with 7 years of harvest so abundant that grain piled like sand along the Nile. Egypt became the breadbasket of the world, drawing nations to its gates. But then the famine came, slow at first, then devastating. Crops failed, livestock died, people wept in the streets, yet Egypt stood prepared, because one man had listened to a dream and another had obeyed the voice behind it. Pharaoh's nightmare had not been a curse but a warning. Drenched in mercy, a chance to prepare before the storm, to act before the hunger set in. And in that foresight, lives were saved, legacies were born, and history was changed. But the story doesn't end in Egypt. The famine stretched beyond borders, reaching the land of Canaan, where Joseph's brothers, the very ones who sold him, now faced the hunger they never saw coming. Desperate, they journeyed to Egypt, unaware that the man holding their fate was the brother they betrayed. And Joseph, though wounded by memory, chose mercy over revenge. The same God who had given him the dream had now brought the dream full circle, restoring family, healing wounds, and revealing purpose in every pain. It was never just about food or power, it was about redemption. Even famine can be a doorway if God is the one leading you through it. Joseph's story reminds us that sometimes the warning comes in the form of fear, that dreams can feel like nightmares when they shake us awake from our comfort. But what if the fear is grace in disguise? What if the sleepless nights and strange visions are God knocking, whispering, urging us to prepare for what we cannot yet see? Pharaoh had everything, wealth, power, armies, but none of it could interpret his dream. He needed a man who knew the voice of God and was willing to speak it, even if it meant standing alone. That's the kind of voice our world still needs, not louder voices but deeper ones. The famine that blanketed the land didn't just test Egypt's granaries, it tested hearts, pride, and priorities. While others panicked, Joseph managed resources with wisdom born not of training, but of trust. Trust in a God who saw what no eye could, who spoke through shadows, who guided through silence. Pharaoh had nightmares, but Joseph had clarity, not because he was immune to fear, but because he had learned to walk through fear holding God's hand. And isn't that what true leadership looks like? Not confidence in yourself, but confidence in the one who sees beyond time. In the midst of global hunger, Joseph became a river of provision, a steady hand in chaos, not because he was perfect, but because he was prepared by pain. Every sleepless night Joseph had spent in prison now made sense. The rejection, the false accusations, the abandonment, all of it had shaped him into the kind of man who wouldn't crumble under the weight of saving nations. His character was carved in isolation, and now it was revealed in public. We often want the platform, the spotlight, the success, but God prepares us in private so we can handle his purpose in public. Joseph was not lucky, he was faithful, and his reward was not comfort, but calling. When Pharaoh feared the future, God sent him a dream, but when Egypt needed a deliverer, God sent Joseph. And sometimes the answer to someone else's nightmare is hidden inside your obedience. Pharaoh's nightmare wasn't just for Pharaoh, it was for Egypt, for the world, and for Joseph's own family. This is the mystery of divine dreams. They often seem personal, but they're woven into a much larger tapestry. What if your current fear is connected to someone else's future? What if your dream, your discomfort, your disruption is part of a plan bigger than you? Joseph didn't just interpret dreams, he became the fulfillment of them. And in doing so, he teaches us that obedience in the present can unlock purpose in the future. Even when that future seems impossible, God is not wasteful with pain. He recycles it into purpose, and he can use even a pagan king's nightmare to move history forward. As the famine grew more intense, nations began pouring into Egypt, desperate, hungry, hopeless. But what they found wasn't just food, they found foresight, a system, a strategy that made Egypt a place of stability, and behind it all was a former prisoner who never let bitterness blind him. Joseph's hands held grain, but his heart held vision. He remembered the God who spoke in dreams, who lifted him from the pit, and who trusted him to carry this responsibility, and perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't the abundance of food, but the transformation of a man, from wounded to wise, from forgotten to foundational, from broken to blessing. The return of Joseph's brothers marked a full-circle moment, not just in story but in spirit. The ones who had stripped him of his coat now stood before him begging for mercy, and instead of vengeance, Joseph wept, not because he was weak but because he had healed. Forgiveness flowed not from forgetting but from seeing the bigger picture. What you meant for evil, he would later say, God meant for good. This is the heart of redemption, not erasing the pain but transforming it. And sometimes the famine isn't just about food, it's about bringing hearts back together, breaking pride, and making space for reconciliation where revenge once ruled. Pharaoh's nightmare had been terrifying, but it had also been merciful, because God doesn't send warnings to punish, He sends them to prepare. And this is what makes Joseph's story timeless. It's not just about dreams or famine, but about listening when God speaks softly in the night. Too often we ignore the inner nudge, the unrest, the whispers in our spirit, calling us to prepare, to repent, to move. We wait for a burning bush, but God often comes as a dream in the dark. The question is, will we ignore it? Or will we, like Joseph, have the courage to act before the storm arrives? Even in modern times, we see famines of a different kind: emotional, spiritual, relational. We face empty hearts, broken systems, and souls starved for meaning. And in these moments, God still speaks, through scripture, through people, through divine nudges we cannot explain. And perhaps, just like Pharaoh, our nightmares are trying to wake us up, not to scare us but to shift us, because behind every discomfort is an invitation, to prepare, to trust, to follow a path that may not make sense now but will one day be the reason we survived what others couldn't. The beauty of Joseph's journey is not just that he rose to power, it's that he never lost the heart of a servant. Even as governor, he wept, he forgave, he remembered. His dreams had been mocked, misunderstood, and delayed, but never denied. And in time, the very dream that had led him into a pit now lifted him into purpose. This is the paradox of divine destiny. It often starts with pain, passes through prisons, and ends in providence. So if you're in the dark, if your dreams feel more like nightmares, hold on. You may be standing in the middle of a story that will feed nations one day. Joseph teaches us that what looks like loss may be God setting the stage, that delays are not denials, and that what seems forgotten is often being prepared. Pharaoh feared famine, but God saw the future, and through a Hebrew slave he saved an empire. So don't ignore the warning signs in your life, whether they come through dreams, doubts, or disruptions. They may be the very things pointing you toward your calling. Listen closely, move wisely, and remember, God always warns before the wave, always plants provision before the drought, always raises a Joseph before the famine. If this story moved you, whispered to something deep inside, or mirrored a dream you've had in silence, take a moment to reflect. Midnight Psalms exist to bring those divine whispers into light. Subscribe, stay with us, and let the night speak, because sometimes what wakes you up might be what saves you.